songs and ballads and social memory and the development of heroes in the song tradition. I was lucky enough a couple of years ago, I got funded to do a radio series on Radio 1 called Hero Songs, which is essentially my chapter, one of my theses. And it was produced by Helen Shaw, who was a fairly well-known name in the RTE world. And we were lucky enough to win the world's best radio program in New York. We won a gold award for that, so that was quite lucky the first time around to be able to do it. So this is really kind of continuing my work, and I want to thank Aileen and her husband, who is not here, Mick, because he's taking care of 1.5 sick children, as I've been told, for inviting me actually to give the talks on the project. I would have known of their work for a long time with different singers projects and everything else over the years, so I was delighted when they asked me to do it. And the tailoring of the talks was a good idea at the time. I sort of regret it as the days go by now, but it's grand, it's adding to my body of knowledge. The reason I chose the title, I suppose, we all know that famous ballad Who Fears to Sing of 1798 from the rebellion of a couple of hundred years ago now. And a search for the songs of the rising, because as I've been looking through my own work, I have discovered that there is a great lack of songs from 1916. You don't really hear about a lot of the composers of the songs at the time, and there are some out there, but there are not a lot. So I want to focus on James Connolly, even though he predates his songs actually predate the Rising by a few years. But it actually goes to showing some of the other concerns besides rebellion leading up to the Rising itself. And I just want to take note of this piece of ephemera. This is actually in the National Library, and one of them had given it to me years ago. But you can see there was a time period, say, before the emergence of the Free State, where singing of particular songs was considered seditious. You could actually be arrested for them, and they arrested ballad singers. There are records that they arrested ballad singers, composers, and things like that. But you can see your man blocking out the names, and it's Memory of the Dead, the Felons of our Land, Kevin Barry, which was my own master's thesis that I did, and Ireland Overall, which I actually only found out the other day was an Eamon Cant song that he composed. And these were the songs of Irish Ireland, the Free Staters who shoot Republicans and fire on prisoners. By England's orders in the name of the Empire can never sing them again. And the artist on this is actually Countess Markovich. So I was quite fascinated to see that. Her artwork actually reminds me a lot of Grace Gifford's, and I think she was influenced a little bit by Grace Gifford's stuff if we compare some of Grace's later things. So before I start talking about James Connolly, I just want to do a bit of a comparison really between the two rebellions. 1798, and you have Wolfe Tone there, and then Pearse in 1916. Now, between the two rebellions, there were a lot of similarities, and this is really nutshell stuff, but I think it actually proves the point. You had a mixture of the classes involved. You had Protestant and Catholic. You had north and south of the border. You had the lower classes, farmers, agricultural, working class people. And then you had the Anglo-Irish upper and middle class, the likes, even in 1803, Robert Emmet, who's very well educated in that. Both rebellions had foreign backing. The French backed 1798, even though Napoleon let Robert Emmet down in 1803. And then the Germans, of course, with Casement going over there and organising the shipments of weapons to come over. Both rebellions, definitely anti-British. I don't think anybody can argue about that. The idea was to get the English out and to be able to rule ourselves. Casualties, again, both sides. You had military and civilian casualties. A lot of women, particularly in 1798, participated, same as with 1916. The result of the rebellions for most of the people involved that were caught resulted either in imprisonment, transportation, or execution. In the case of a lot of them, you think Henry John McCracken, Robert Emmet, Wolfe Tone, all the rest of them. And some, in the case of John Mitchell, self-imposed exile later on. Both, whether we like it or not, both rebellions were unsuccessful. You could say they were moral victories, but I don't think you can actually get a moral victory out of a failed rebellion, because the end result was not achieved. We did not get to rule ourselves. We did not get out of under the thumb of England. Now, two of the big differences I see between these, and this is where I think the songs will come into it. 1798, you had a very public awareness that this rebellion was going to take place. Everyone from the grassroots level up were mobilising and getting weapons together. You had it all the way from Killala in Mayo down to Wexford and then Enniscorthy, and everything in between. There was mobilization of the entire country. 1916 was essentially a covert operation. You had little cells of the IRB and the Irish Volunteers and eventually the Citizen Army that were discussing this, and you had the military council that was organising what was going to happen. But the country overall did not know that this was going to hit until Easter Monday, when they're enjoying the bank holiday, they're sitting around having tea, they're walking in the parks, they're out at Ferryhouse Racecourse, and suddenly the shells start flying and the bullets start flying, and lads are beating down their doors to try and get into the houses to set up some sort of an operation. So there was a complete blindsiding, I think, of the general public, which is why a lot of the public were not behind the rising of 1916 until after the executions. 1798 also, I think it had a much more cohesive agenda. It was more set out as to what they wanted to achieve and what they were going to do afterwards. 1916, while you had the proclamation, which essentially set out a lot of little points and agendas, I've often wondered what would have happened had they succeeded. Did they have a plan B as to what they were going to do afterwards? Now it seems like they might have done, because eventually, we have the first Dáil and all that, they're forming their own government. But I really wonder if the rebellion itself had happened and suddenly England were out and we ruled ourselves, what we would have done if they had that continued. So to a certain extent, I think 1916 had a very fractious agenda. Now, if we move into the songs, and a lot of this is very hypothetical, I suppose, but it's what I'm finding from what I'm looking at. This is essentially looking at, say, ballad production and ballad composition from very early on up until the period of the Rising. And I start with in 1795 with Paddy's Resource, and just in case anybody doesn't know, that is a sketch of probably the most well-known Dublin ballad singer, Michael Moran, or Zosimus, who's actually buried in Glasnevin Cemetery. Paddy's Resource was printed in 1795, and it was the handbook, essentially, the songbook of the United Irishmen. And it was the first book of its kind. It was published by James Porter, the first edition anyway. And it was made for modern patriotic songs compiled for the use of the people of Ireland. And that's something to actually keep in mind about that book, and when we get to some of the later compositions, is it was meant for the people of Ireland. It was meant for the masses, and they wanted people to sing these songs. From the period of the rebellion itself, 1798, we have very few extant songs. The main one that seems to have been transmitted from the time of the event is Dún Laoghaire, and it's actually still sung and recorded quite a bit today, and that was from 1798. Then between the period of 1840 to 1860, you have this huge outpouring of ballad compositions by Thomas Davis and other writers of the nation, say James Clarence Mangan, and that, like, he wrote My Dark Rosaleen and that. So you have that period where within the newspaper, within the nation, every single week or every time that paper is printed, they're actually printing ballads and they're printing new songs. They're consistently writing them for public consumption. And there's even an edition of the Nation that I looked at that it actually gives instructions to the public as to how to write a ballad, which is quite funny to read. But they were trying to get the general public into this thing of writing songs because they actually knew the power of song and the power of telling the story. So if you move then 1867, and I think this is actually quite a transitional point, with T.D. Sullivan's ballad, God Save Ireland. Because as we'll see later on when I talk about some of the specific songs, there's actually a tempo change. It goes from very slow narrative songs to marching songs. And this song actually commemorated, for those of you who don't know, the Manchester Martyrs. And it was written on the, just very shortly after their execution in England. Move forward a bit then, 1898, the centenary of 1798, and again you have this huge outpouring of ballads. P.J. McCall is probably one of the most well-known. He wrote Bula Vogue, The Boys of Wexford, Kelly the Boy from Callan. And that, I think, is the point when ballad production starts to actually decline, is after that centenary of 1798. So the main writer at the time, Patrick Carney, who wrote the Soldier Song and a rake of other songs and ballads, as well as adapting a lot, he had a huge outpouring, and I talked about him last week at the National Library. He had a huge outpouring of songs at that point. But ballad production, for whatever reason, and I think there are any number of reasons, starts to decline, so that by 1916 you have a few being written by the participants, like Connolly, whose labour songs we'll talk about, O'Donovan Rossa, who actually wrote a Fenian ballad, Thomas MacDonagh, who wrote a Fenian march, Countess Markovitz, who wrote a couple of songs. She wrote the Battle Hymn, which most people know, and then a version of Kevin Barry, which is not really great, to be honest. Parry Pearse, importantly enough, recycles Oroshid of Achawellia, and a lot of people don't know that that song was actually a Jacobite ballad, and it goes back, it actually represented Bonnie Prince Charlie, but he changes it to use the idea of Gráinne Mhaol, and it becomes the unofficial marching song of the Irish Volunteers at the time. And then, of course, you have Pat Carney. So just keeping some of that in mind now, if we keep the idea of the public awareness and the covert operation, that I'll just talk a bit about James Connolly. And trying to sum up this man is very tough, which is why he gets 2 slides in this now. But what fascinates me about people of this time is looking at their developing views, particularly because Connolly was one of the older participants in the Rising. What drives somebody to get to that point where you are going to just rebel? You believe in violence and you're going to rebel. His early years had great influence, I think anyway, in his interest in social and the socialist and labour movements. He was born the 5th of June in 1868 in Edinburgh. It was the Cowgate district of Edinburgh, and it was one of 2 slum areas. The other was actually called the Grassmarket, and these 2 areas were known as Little Ireland. Both parents had emigrated from County Monaghan in the 1850s. His father, John, worked as a manure carter, which is probably what you think it is. It basically meant he cleared the streets of manure in the dead of night. It was not the best job in the world. He was actually later promoted to a gas lighter, so he got to go around during the day or early evening and actually light the gas lamps. But unfortunately, due to changing circumstances and ill health, he was actually demoted later again back to being a manure carter. His mother was Mary McGinn. She worked as a domestic servant for most of her life. She suffered from chronic bronchitis, and this was actually looked on as a disease of the poverty-stricken because you were living in damp conditions, you were not necessarily getting enough food or anything else. So she suffered from this through her entire life. She eventually died in 1891 at the age of 58. Now, Connolly was the youngest of 3. They were all boys. His older brothers were John, who seems to have been the main influence, and Thomas was the other one, and I don't know very much about him, to be honest. There's very little written about him. He left school at the age of 10 or 11, which probably would have been standard, I suppose, for that time. Very few people actually finished school at that age. He worked in Edinburgh's Evening News as a printer's devil, and this was the poor lad who used to have to clean all the inky rollers, which would not have been the nicest job. But the reason he got in there was because his eldest brother John was working as an apprentice compositor, and I suppose what we would call that today is it would be the equivalent of graphics designer. He was the one that took the typeface and the illustrations and laid it all out before the paper went to press. And according to Lorcan Collins' biography of Connolly, which is a very good one, it's part of the 16 Lives set of books, Connolly was actually forced to leave the print works when the factory inspector made his rounds and deemed Connolly too young to be working there, even though he had actually been given a box to stand on. So they knew he shouldn't have been working there anyway, but they gave him a box to stand on just so he would look older. He worked then as apprentice baker for 2 years and started suffering from ill health, and then he finally found a post in a mosaics factory. By the age of 14, he actually followed his brother John's example and joined the British Army. He falsified his age, and I think he falsified his name as well, if Lorcan is right about his research, and eventually ended up in Cork in 1882, and it was the first time on Irish soil. Now, it wasn't unknown that young lads would lie about their age. There is a lad, Harold Washington, who was killed during the Kevin Barry incident, and it was only reported in one newspaper that he was 15 or 16 at the time he was killed, so he was another one who would have joined up underage. He actually decided when he was in Ireland, he finally went AWOL in 1889 from the army because he had met Lily in Dublin, who became his wife in 1890. Lily Reynolds was her maiden name. And they're not quite sure why he went AWOL, other than maybe he wanted to stay with Lily. We don't really have information on that. But he eventually returned to Scotland to visit his ill father in Perth, and then Lily followed later. And this sort of starts a pattern of separation that seems to have been with Connolly and his family his entire life. They seem to live more separate lives, actually, than they were together as any kind of a family. His interest in socialism and labour now starts when he returns really to Scotland. And again, it was his brother John who was involved with the Scottish labour movement in Dundee. And he introduced James to the idea of socialism. It was here that Connolly met James Leslie, who was the secretary of the Social Democratic Federation in Scotland. He convinced Connolly not to immigrate to Chile with his family by publicly pleading for a post for Connolly in Dublin. Why Connolly wanted to go to Chile, I have no idea, because the economic conditions at that point weren't any good either. But Leslie literally wrote a letter and he sent it to every publication in Dublin, pleading that this man be given a job in Dublin so he could actually remain here. So in 1896, he was actually offered a post by the Dublin Socialist Club as the club organiser and earned a whopping £1 a week, which I suppose at that time that must have been fairly good wages now. Leslie and other members of the SDF actually raised funds to pay for the passage for Lily, and at this point his 3 children to come from Scotland over to Dublin. Later that year he founded the Irish Socialist Republican Party. 1898 he established the Workers' Republic newspaper. 1902 he was contacted by Daniel de Leon, who was the driving force behind the American Socialist Labour Party. And he invited Connolly to America to lecture, and it was a tour that lasted several months. So again, he's separated from Lily and the children because they're still in Dublin. He returns to Edinburgh and chairs the first meeting of the Socialist Labour Party, but became very disillusioned because the party was making no progress. So in 1903, he officially immigrated to America after visiting his family in Dublin. So again, the separation continues. So the second part of his life really goes the return to Ireland. He returned, I should say the family actually eventually did make it over to New York, and they got settled and things were going along grand for a while. From the early part of the socialist movement, you can see Connolly's disillusionment starting at that point. He actually told John Leslie when he met him again that there were 2 mistakes he'd made in his life. One was going to America and the other was coming back. Now this is where he really starts focusing on the labour movement, particularly in Ireland. In 1910 he returns to Belfast. He organises the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. His family, of course, still in New York. In November, though, Connolly sent a letter to Lily asking her to actually come over finally with the family and make preparations to return to Dublin. And Lily was not thrilled with this. She had her life set up, she had the children in school, everything was fine, but of course, being the dutiful wife, she was going to come back. 1910, 1911, he went on a lecture tour of Ireland, essentially giving the same sort of talks as he did in America. In 1913, he co-founded the Irish Labour Party and the Irish Citizen Army, and organised the opposition to the lockout with Big Jim Larkin, as we all know. 1914, he became commander of the ICA and was the acting general secretary of the ITGWU when Larkin went over to America and was then arrested. The beginning of World War I seems to have actually been the final straw for Connolly in terms of his views towards violent rebellion and violent preparation of things. Particularly when the socialists and the trade unionists in mainland Europe began supporting the war. He expected them to be anti-war because it was an imperial war, and he expected them to actually fight against this. And he previously did not advocate armed struggles, if you could avoid it, because the way he looked at the lockout was not an armed struggle. It only became an armed struggle when the RIC started attacking the workers at that time. So he began to realize then that an insurrection might be the only way for any ground to be gained in terms of either a labour movement or Ireland starting to rule itself. And in 1916, he agreed actually to join forces with the IRB for the planned rising, and he became military commander of the garrison of the GPO, where he was wounded. And we all know in 1916, 28th of May, he was executed, probably one of the most appalling executions of the rising, in that he was tied to a chair and subsequently executed. He's buried in Arbor Hill. It's interesting to note this cover of, this was for the farewell dinner to James Connolly, and it's very American in a sense the way it's written, because on the one side it says good speakers, come bring your family, you will enjoy yourself, a feast of, what is this, a feast of mirth, a night of Irish song and story, real Irish song and story. But what I like at the very bottom is it says, don't miss this occasion to tell Connolly what you think of him. I don't know a lot of politicians that would actually have the nerve to put that on any of their dinner pamphlets nowadays, but I thought that was a very brilliant little touch, like, you know. I don't think many people would have been against Connolly at the time, however. So I want to start looking at, there are 3 songbooks that actually deal with Connolly's songs, and if anybody ever manages to get hold of this, I got the last copy off of the book depository a couple of weeks ago. Matt Callanan, who I think is living in Switzerland, but I could be wrong, did quite a bit of research, and this has been my main source, on the 3 songbooks that deal with Connolly's songs. The first one, of course, was the one Connolly published in 1907, and it was Songs of Freedom. It was published in New York by J.D.C. Donnelly, and it's subtitled The Take and Hold Book, which is actually the name of the heir for the watchword, or what later became the watchword of Labour. There are 18 songs in total, and I think it's important, I want to read the introduction out of it because it goes sort of with the idea of Thomas Davis and the Nation individuals as to why Connolly put this book together. This little book of revolutionary songs is published for a twofold purpose. First, it's in response to the belief of the editor that no, and this was changed from an, revolutionary movement is complete without its poetical expression. If such a movement has caught hold of the imagination of the masses, they will seek a vent in song for the aspirations, the fears and the hopes, the loves and the hatreds engendered by the struggle. Until the movement is marked by the joyous, defiant singing of revolutionary songs, it lacks one of the most distinctive marks of a popular revolutionary movement. It is the dogma of a few and not the faith of the multitude. In this belief, this small bouquet of songs, culled from a very limited garden, I really love that line, is offered until someone with greater means shall present to the American working class a more suitable collection, drawn not from the store of one nation alone, but from the socialist poetry of the world. The propagandist effect of such a volume of songs with their proper musical setting would be simply incalculable. The second purpose of this volume may be readily guessed by a glance at its contents. It will be seen that every song herein contained was written by an Irishman. Now that's not entirely true, because James Connolly, of course, even though he was of Irish parentage, he was born in Scotland. John Leslie wrote some composition as well, and he had, I think his mother was Irish and his father was Scottish. He also includes songs written by others, so that's not, he's stretching the truth just a bit there now. But basically within the first book, there are 9 compositions by Connolly, including a love song. And I just want to give you a verse or two of this because it's quite interesting. I'm sure you all recognize the air, but it's not the love song you think it's going to be. It's actually not to Lily. It's a love song to freedom. Let's see if I can get this now. I love you, though told make obscure, and make darker the light of my eye. Though slow runs my blood, and my heart it is pure. Whoops, sorry now. Though slow runs my blood, my heart it is pure, beats calmer when women are nigh. Yet on from my heart comes a passionate wail, with a note of sincerity true. The protest of that heart, though its vigor may fail, yet beats stronger in love, dear, for you. And it's actually to freedom. It's not actually to Lily. And of course, that's the air of Believe Me, Those Endearing Young Charms, which was a quite popular tune of the day. There were also 3 compositions by John Leslie. And I want to give a bit, because again, this is an air you'll probably all recognize. This is called The Symbol. With the symbol and the sign, rank on rank and line on line, true pioneers of liberty we come. Light for all the blind we hear, the thunder so that deaf may hear, and true Pentecostal fires for the dumb. Forward to liberty advancing, forward to freedom from the thrall. Come with willing heart and hand, all who hear a common brand, with the blood-bright flag of freedom over all. And of course, that's God Save Ireland. So that was another popular tune, and you can see that carrying through from 1867. Connolly was aware of Paddy's Resource because he actually includes a good bit of material from Paddy's Resource and 1790 as well. He includes The Rights of Man, he includes Drinking and Thinking, otherwise known as the Crushkeen Lawn, and The Standard of Freedom. But he also includes Richard Brimsley Sheridan's translation of the Marseillaise. So again, this is harking back, as even 1798 did, back to 1792 in the French Rebellion. So there's all this linkage going on with previous periods of rebellion. And I have to say, I was looking at the Marseillaise, and I think you have to actually redo, because it doesn't fit in with the way the tune is written, so I think there's a reworking of it. And then of course he included the Red Flag, which was a very socialist anthem of the time by James Connell. So in 1919, and this is the emergence of a second songbook really, in 1919 the Association of Ireland actually organised a concert to be given to sing all of Connolly's songs that were in the previous book. Now it was originally scheduled for the Mansion House to celebrate the anniversary of Connolly's birth, but unfortunately it was proclaimed under the Defence of the Realm Act. So when everybody arrived at the Mansion House for this concert, it was actually guarded by the police. So the Irish Citizen Army starts mobilising to try and get things sorted so they can actually do this. And there was shooting, it was a whole palaver, it was a riot essentially. But it was eventually moved to the Trades Hall later that evening. The ticket cost a whole 1 shilling. The proceeds went towards the establishment of a Connolly Memorial Workers' College. And the organising committee is quite interesting, the names that are part of it now, because you had the likes of Mrs. James Connolly, Miss Nora Connolly, Mrs. Tom Clark, Dr. Kathleen Lynn, Madam Markovich, Madam Gon McBride, Mrs. Mallon. You can see where this is going. It's all of the wives and people who were still remaining after of those executed in the Rising. Now, there's an interesting song in here. Two songs. You have two new songs that were actually composed by Connolly that had not been in the first book. A rebel song and the Call of Erin. And the Call of Erin I found quite interesting, just because of some of the other stuff I've done. The air attached to it, if anybody knows their music, they will know this air. Rolling Home to Bonnie Scotland. You may not know it by the title, but you'll definitely know it by the lyrics, or by the air. With the engines 'neath us throbbing, and the wind upon our stern, little reck we of the distance that divides us now from Erin. For we hear her voices calling, sweeping past us on the waves, calling home to her dear children she once nourished on her breast. She is calling, 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 in the wind and o'er the tide. We, her children, hear her voices call us over to her side. And of course, Kevin Barry. And the Rolling Home to Bonnie Scotland is interesting. It's actually what's known as a floating air. So it was one of those tunes that if you're from England, you said Rolling Home to Dear Old England. If you're from Ireland, it was Rolling Home to Dear Old Ireland and things like that. But it was a tune then, of course, that was put on to Kevin Barry, but also put on to Terence McSweeney for Shall My Soul Pass Through Old Ireland. And it's one of those long-standing tunes. Now, he wrote something very interesting as well, and I don't know if you'll be able to see it from the book. This is a verse manifesto called The Legacy, and there's at least 50 verses in it, as I can count now. The typeface is very tiny. But there seemed to be a tendency, and I was only after recently finding one by Terence McSweeney called The Music of Freedom, where these were things that were not meant to be sung, but it was a manifesto actually written in verse. And it's quite a touching one because the subtitle of it is A Dying Socialist to His Son. And it was basically what he was telling his son he was hoping would live on after he was dead. And I'll just read one of the verses because it's I definitely don't believe these are meant to be sung, to be honest. My legacy, a son of mine, wouldst thou a rich man's pride. He crowned thee with his property, pensions far and wide, and golden store to purchase slaves, whose aching brain and limb would toil to bring you luxury as such had toiled for him. But thy father is a poor man, and glancing round you here, thou canst see all his property, or humble household gear. No will we need by lawyers drawn, no witnesses attest, to guard for you your legacy, your father's last bequest. And it keeps going throughout that until finally he dies and his son is left with this legacy. There's also the edition in this of the translation of the International by Eugène Potier. The International, for anybody interested in socialism, communism, anything like that, was a very well-known anthem as well at the time. And as the gentleman was saying earlier, the advertisements are amazing in this thing for what they printed for a souvenir program. And the great thing about this book is Germano actually reproduced everything exactly. He photocopied the advertisements and everything else. But it's all the voice of labour for labour's rights, socialist clubs, socialist reading rooms, all this kind of thing. So it was very sort of one-sided with what they were looking at. And then finally, the last one wasn't actually printed. The last James Connolly songbook wasn't printed until 1972. And it was actually done by the Cork Workers Club. The first edition, I think, is actually sold out in 1980. A second version was printed, and apparently you can actually find them in a few bookstores. But a fellow by the name of Jim Lane, who was a member of the Cork Workers Club, was responsible for printing and writing the introduction. And he's actually, as far as I know, is 2013, he was still alive. I don't know if he's living in Cork or if he's living in the States, but he's actually still kicking around. In this book, there were 23 songs and poems in total, 9 previously unpublished of Connolly's work. So it's only with this that we get the full canon of Connolly's songs. Most of them, unfortunately, the later ones, don't have any air attached to them, which is actually quite a pain. But what they wrote in the introduction for the Cork Workers Club is interesting because it's what they're encouraging people to do now with the songs then. Many of Connolly's songs, like many working class songs of the time, were sung to the air of popular songs, but as many of these airs have long passed on in public memory, we suggest that where possible, workers should adapt his songs to the airs of today's popular songs and ballads. So essentially he's trying to encourage people to sing these songs by fitting them to whatever tunes they can. It's not easy to do now. I know Matt Callanan has actually done a CD of all of Connolly's tunes and he's adapted most of them. I haven't listened to a lot of them now. And again, that's really the only problem with the book is the fact that there are no airs to the things, so you have to kind of work to put those together. So I just want to look at a couple of manuscripts, and I know that one is very faded. It's from the NLI, but I just thought the fact that it was in Connolly's writing was amazing. There are 2 songs. The Watchword of Labour seems to have been the most popular one in the sense of this is the only one that seems to have been printed with official sheet music by a publisher. It was Whelan and Son on Upper Ormond Quay in Dublin, which was a very well-known sheet music publisher at the time. But what I've noticed in a lot of the things I found is that they didn't publish something unless they knew it was popular and it caught on, because of course they wanted to make money. So, let's see now. This image actually came from the Irish Traditional Music Archive. They have a lovely online exhibition, if you will, at the moment of 1916 ephemera of different sheet music and everything else of Countess Markovitz and some of the other people arising. So it's actually worth looking at their online exhibition. So I want to try and give a blast of this one now. It's quite an interesting song to sing. It's very complicated. And I love my research because I get to actually look at things like this. So I'm doing a bit of sight reading on this as well. But the words for the original are actually different from what they were in the sheet music. And you'll hear what kind of a tempo of song this is, because it's again, it's going on from this idea of the T.D. Sullivan, the God Save Ireland. Oh, hear ye the watchword of labour, the slogan of they who'd be free, that no more to any enslaver must labour bend suppliant knee, that we on whose shoulders are borne the pomp and the pride of the great, whose toil they repaid with their scorn, should meet it at last with our hate, then send it afar on the breeze, boys, that watchword the grandest we've known, that labour must rise from its knees, boys, and claim the broad earth as its own. So it's a very march, and I've actually heard people sing this very slowly, but the sheet music actually says Tempo de Marcia, so it's meant to be a march tempo tune. And it's quite interesting that the sheet music, the one line that I sang there, the should meet it at last with our hate, is actually softened in the sheet music version, because it actually says, where are we at here? Must challenge and master our fate. So I think that's quite interesting, because obviously, to a certain extent, Connolly was inciting a bit of hatred against the enemy. He was trying to rouse people up and everything else, but they actually kind of watered it down when it got to the sheet music, which I suppose for public consumption you had to do that sort of thing. Now the other song, which is that manuscript, is one called When Ireland Calls, and this manuscript actually was from a letter to John J. Ling around 1903. Ling was the acting secretary of the Irish Socialist Federation in New York, and he wrote the draft of the song here. And there's a few changes in the verse that I'll talk about afterwards, but I want to give this one, because I'll be honest with you, I really like this song, and it's not the kind of thing you would normally go around singing. But I'll talk about the air that's attached to it when I get through it. When labour calls her children forth, a waiting world to win, earth's noblest breed, true men of worth, her rank shall enter in. Then, comrades, all prepare, that we may hear that call anon, and drive the host of tyranny like clouds before the dawn, and drive our foes like clouds before the dawn. I really love that. There's something about it that makes the hair stand up on the back of my neck. And it's interesting because it's actually the air to the Transvaal National Anthem. And if anybody can tell me how Connolly would have known the Transvaal National Anthem, I would be very interested to hear it, because when you consider at that time you didn't have recordings or Google or YouTube or anything like that to be able to get this air, I'm very curious as to how we actually knew that air. And I have to laugh, because the only way I was able to learn the air was to sing the English words over the Dutch version, because that's all that exists on the internet. So I was roaring this in my office, which I shouldn't have done, but that was how I was actually learning the air. But you can see there's this kind of rousing sense of things. It's a minor march tune, but it gets you geared up. There's something very emotive, I think, and very powerful about anthems. And you can imagine, I don't know how popular this song was, I really wish I could find out, but as far as I've been able to glean, it's never been recorded, which I think is a shame, because I think it's one of his better airs. So if we go back now to the points I was making earlier about the public awareness and the covert operation, and that I want to just give you a few verses of earlier songs and then leading up to this point we are with Connolly. And I just sort of want you to maybe just kind of think about the sound of the songs, what they're trying to say and everything else, because it'll go to the earlier points I was saying as to why 1798 might be more singable than 1916. And the first one I'll give you is actually a couple of verses of Dún Laoghaire, which is the one contemporaneous with 1798. false information were shot on Dún Laoghaire Green. There is young Matty Farrell, who has plenty of cause to complain. Likewise the two Duffys, who were shot down upon the plain. Young Andy Ryan, his mother distracted will run, for the loss of her darling, her only beloved son. And then a little later on there's a ballad, I think that came out closer to the centenary actually. It's an adaptation of an old song called "'Twas on the Belfast Mountain." And this was actually dedicated to Henry John McCracken. It was rewritten. I don't know who actually adapted it now. I don't think anybody knows that. That night I climbed the cave hill and watched till morning blazed. When its fires were kindled, o'er Belfast loch I gazed. I saw an English tender at anchor off Carmoil, but alas no good ship bore him away to France's soil. And twice that night a trampin' came from down the old shore road. 'Twas Ellis and his yeoman was Niblock with them rode. My father home returned, the doleful story told. Now, lass, says he, young Harry Joy for £50 is sold. And just a couple of verses then to move up to 1867. The God Save Ireland, which again, as I said, I think it's a very transitional point at this stage. Climb they up the rugged stair, rang their voices out in prayer, then with England's fatal cord around them cast. Close beside the gallows tree, kissed like brothers lovingly, true to home and faith and freedom to the last. God save Ireland, said the heroes, God save Ireland, said they all. Whether on the scaffold high or the battlefield we die, oh, what matter when for Erin dear we fall. And then we come a bit now to Pater Carney. And I just want to give a couple of verses of a couple of things he wrote. Now, the song The Tricolour Ribbon was actually not written by him entirely. It was actually an adaptation of an 1820s ballad, and was essentially about a young lad who was caught for thieving and he was being transported to Australia. But this became quite a lively song that was actually sung at the time when Pater had done it. Let's see. He whispered, goodbye, love, old Ireland is calling. High over Dublin our tricolour flies. In the streets of the city the foeman is falling. We birds are singing, old Ireland arise. And all around my hat I wear a tricoloured ribbon, oh, all around my hat until death comes to me. And if anybody's asking me, oh, why I'm wearing that ribbon, no, it's all for my own true love I never more will see. His bandolier around him, his bright bayonet shining, his short service rifle a beauty to see. There was joy in his eyes, though he left me repining. Started away for to make Ireland free. And then it goes back into the chorus, of course. And another one now, which is kind of a, I suppose it's a mick-take really of the whole situation with Ireland at the time, so it was kind of a risky song to be writing, was a song called Whack-Fall the Diddle. And it's more, the recordings I've actually heard of this one, it's actually more of a talked song than actually a sung song, so we'll see how this goes now. When we were savage, fierce and wild, whack-fall the diddle, fall died o' day. She came as a mother to her child, whack-fall the diddle, fall died o' day. Gently raised us from the slime, kept our hands from hellish crime, and sent us to heaven in her own good time. Whack falla diddle falla dido day, whack falla diddle falla dido day. So we say, hip hooray, God bless England while we pray. Whack falla diddle falla dido day. Our fathers oft were naughty boys. Whack falla diddle falla dido day. Pikes and guns are dangerous toys. Whack falla diddle falla dido day. From Bellabui to Peter's Hill, they made poor England weep her fill. But old Britannia loves us still. Whack falla diddle falla dido day. So given the time period and everything else, it's quite uplifting little songs that are being sung. But is there something to sing about at this point? You know, they were good for marching songs, let's put it that way. And another one again by Pat O'Carney, which is sort of harkening back, I suppose, the earlier ballads, is the Down by the Glenside. When I was a young girl, they're marching and drilling, awoke in the Glenside, sounds awesome and thrilling. They loved dear old Ireland, to die they were willing. Glory-o, glory-o, to the bold Fenian men. Some died by the Glenside, some died near a stranger, and wise men have told us their cause was a failure, but they fought for old Ireland and never feared danger. Glory-o, glory-o, to the bold Fenian men. And I want to just give a verse of a song that probably most of you won't have heard, and it's quite interesting. It's a lesser known song by Countess Markievicz, and I only got it through Mick, who had given me a manuscript from somebody else, but it was called the Fianna Battle Song. And she wrote it, and I'll quote her here now. I was requested to write a Fianna Battle song to this air by Liam, the last time I saw him being Liam Mellows. I wrote it when I heard of his death, December 8, 1922, and it's signed Countess Markievicz. The air is the red flag. Now again, if you know your songs, you're going to know this air. I was quite shocked because I actually didn't know the air to the red flag, so when I started singing it, I realized, oh, that's what that one is. So, we pledge ourselves by Liam's grave, by all who died their land to save, by Colbert and by Houston's death, by every martyr's dying breath. Republicans, we stand for aid, we soldier boys who fight each day to win the war against Ireland's foes. In crimson drops our lifeblood flows. We pledge ourselves by murder's dark, in barracks of Abandoned Park, by tortured boys in Free State jails, by Christchurch side and torturing nails. Then join your voice with Ireland's dead, in prayer that God will help us tread the cruel path with honour bright that leads to freedom, Ireland's right. I don't think I'll ever be able to sing O Tannenbaum in the same way again because I keep hearing these songs now in my head. And just one last one I want to add, because a friend of mine, now I've never met the man, I should say, qualify this now. There's a Facebook site that if you ever get a chance to look on it, it's called the Old Republican Ballad Group. And there's a fellow on there, Turlough O'Brien, who is always posting things and he's always sending me things. But he sent me this one ballad broadsheet, and I don't know a date of it, I don't know anything about it, called the Dublin Citizen Army. And it was a song for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And I have yet to research to find it now, but I'll see if I can get the air to it, because it's the Rakes of Mallow is actually the air. Come, bring the glory. Okay. Come, my boys, and sing the glory of our comrades famed in story. When Dublin streets were gory, fought in the citizen army. Dublin's sons were Ireland's pride, patriots trust to them must bide. Heroes all in battle tried, the Irish Citizen Army. So it's quite a little jaunty thing, but what got me about it is written under a pseudonym, and the pseudonym is Dún Laoghaire. So I've yet to actually find out anything about who was using the pseudonym at the time. But I think you can hear sort of some of the differences that are going on with these songs, particularly from 1798 leading up to 1916. We're going back to this point again now of public awareness and covert operation. I think a lot of this actually feeds into the composition of these songs. Again, 1798 up to Kearney's era and everything else, Thomas Davis and T.D. Sullivan, all the rest of them were writing the songs for the public. No more than 1798 was a public rebellion. And this is what these songs were being read into. Kearney and the others, with the march tempo tunes, were actually writing to inspire the soldiers. They were writing to inspire the lads who were going to battle. You know, this is why Oro Shidavacha Wale became an unofficial marching song of the Irish Volunteers. I think to a great extent you have men versus women here, particularly in the style of song. You hear the likes of Dún Laoghaire and Henry Ger McCracken are very much gentle songs. Men and women could sing them and they're telling a story. Marches, women didn't go around singing marches. This was not a song you could, unless you're maybe cleaning the house or something, you need something to keep going, or ironing or something like that. But I think they were written for two different types, really. The differences between the songs themselves, tune types, you had much more popular airs and everything else, slow airs at that time for the earlier songs. The later things are definitely, as I've said, the march time tunes. The content really changes a lot. The early songs, Dún Laoghaire and Henry Ger McCracken, are solid narrative songs. They are telling the story. They are telling the names of the people involved. They're telling the geographic locations. It's a telescopic view of the events happening at the time. And it's quite emotive when you hear that, because you can almost harken back to what must have actually happened at the time. The Henry Ger McCracken song is brilliant because you could literally trace Henry Joy's movements through that song the night before he was captured and eventually executed. The content, when you start with God Save Ireland, the lads' names are not mentioned in it. Larkin, Allen and O'Brien never come up. It was understood that everybody would have known who they were. And a lot of, I think, the later songs, it would have been understood that people knew who the songs were referring to. So they don't concentrate on a story, and they don't necessarily concentrate on remembering necessarily the people in as much detail. I think Countess Markowitz is probably much closer in the early stuff than anybody else. And again, the function, very different. Early songs telling the story, the marching songs, maybe to take your mind off of things. Thomas Davis and the others were trying to raise public awareness of England's wrongs by writing these songs. The other ones, they were just trying to keep the lads going when they were going through their training. And maybe there's a reason for this. When you look at the bulk of the output for 1798, it was 100 years later. And maybe one needs that temporal distance before you can sort of look at these events with that kind of eye, with the distance of things, so it's not so emotional. I mean, Dún Laoghaire is a fairly emotional song if you hear the whole thing sung. It's heartbreaking to hear it. And I think there was also, because of the lack of the public support about the Rising, there was a silence about it, that only now, 100 years later, we're actually starting to break this silence. And maybe that's what happened in 1898. Maybe they weren't talking about 1798 and the massacres. Maybe it took 100 years to be able to start talking about that again. And I think it's very fortuitous at this point now that we have a song project going on where people are actually looking back and they're actually starting to find the voice to be able to find the things to sing about 1916. Because there are things to sing about. It was a failure, yes, but some things got achieved. We haven't necessarily lived up to them yet, but there were things that are worth singing about. And I think hopefully the songs that are being written now are going to determine how 1916 will be remembered in the future. Because I think 1898 songs did the same thing. It determined how we were going to remember 1798. So it's very fortunate now, I think, that we have a project to hopefully change the fact that there were no songs about 1916 into having new ones now that people will sing. So thank you very much for listening. You've all been very attentive. And I will take questions or comments if anybody has any.
I imagine that's come through the Transvaal Committee, which was set up here 1899 when the Boer War happened. Donald Fallon gave a
that's what the Griffith connection is what I was thinking.
There was a copy, I had a copy of a song which the Waltons brought out many years ago, and the songs of Arthur Griffith, and there are a number of songs about the Transvaal.
Yeah, I was thinking the Griffith connection, alright, more than.
The other thing, the battle song, sung to Tannenbaum, as far as I'm aware, and I have to check out this, check yourself, but Manus O'Riordan always said that Jim Connell, when he wrote the Red Flag, he didn't want it sung to Tannenbaum. He wanted sung to the White Cockade.
The White Cockade, yeah, that was the original. No, that is because there's a note in the Connolly songbook on that as well that it was meant to be the White Cockade. All right, yeah.
About the man who signed the pseudonym Dún Laoghaire. Do you know what year that was?
No, I have no year on it. Nothing. Turlock has.
If you get me a year, I reckon we
no,
can find out.
Turlock. There's no information on the bloody thing. It's one of these loose little pieces of ephemera the NLI has, and there's no information on it. There's no information on it.
Email me the song words much you can find and see if we can find out here because we do have.
It's a lovely little ditty now. I have to say, like, yeah.
Just tours of Dean's Grange Cemetery, and he's a local historian. Jamie, I'd say, would have some information.
Yeah. Yeah, it's very interesting. It's very interesting now, like, yeah, because it's only a little tiny piece of paper it's printed on. It's only that big, like.
I'd love to find out. I'm guessing we might be able to find out.
So,
yep.
I just thought.
Okay, sorry.
Is James Connolly buried?
As far as I know, Arbor Hill.
I
Yeah, no, because what happened when they were executed in Kilmainham, the bodies were quick-lined and they didn't want public funerals or anything else, so they didn't go to Glasnevin. They were put into Arbor Hill and now obviously you wouldn't be able to reinter them because if they were quick-lined, there'd be nothing left. Like, but the Republican plots in Glasnevin, all right, marking out all the lads, but no, they're in Arbor Hill. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Alright, I just say
Sorry. Nice try, Aileen.
Just more points.
Yeah.
I was surprised, and I don't really have any information on it about you saying that there weren't that many contemporary or recent songs from 1798. Because where I grew up in Wicklow, there were things like Billy Byrne and Ballynanis and ones like that I thought were actually very old. You know what I mean? Second point is, I'm glad you pointed out the thing about Paddock Carney and Whackfall the Diddle, because one of the things that I was struck with the 1916 crowd, with the exception of Tom MacDonagh, they were a totally humorous lot. You know, it wasn't one bit of lightness about a lot of them, you know. And that always sort of like that was a little bit of a problem. But see Paddock Carney writing a jokey song was something else. I have a problem with him, by the way.
Few people do actually.
Well, what it is, he writes Paddock Carney. He writes he always says he writes the national anthem. We sing the national anthem in Irish.
Yeah, but it was English.
He wrote only the English words.
Exactly, yeah.
For the air, for the Irish.
And it's interesting. Well, when I gave the talk at the NLI last week, I was focusing on Paddock Carney, so I talked about Paddy Heaney putting the music to it and everything else, and I actually sang the English version because most people hadn't heard it. But what was interesting while I was doing the research for that is I actually found another Irish version, and I haven't done the research yet in terms of figuring out, because there's a lot of similarities because but it was written by a different person and it's very similar to what we sing now. But like, I'm not sure which came, it's a chicken egg thing, I'm not sure who did what first, but it always makes me laugh that the soldier song is sung like a funeral dirge and GA things. It's always this slow, monotonous thing. And it's supposed to be, soldiers are we, you know, it's supposed to be this rousing little anthem, and yet it's sung like a funeral dirge.
Absolutely.
And he got, and the horrible thing is, he never got, barring £100 from a priest in New York who actually was responsible for disseminating soldier song in the States, Carney never received a dot of money for it. Like.
I think he got 1,800 in the 1930s.
Yeah, I don't think, not from what I know anyway, not from what I know at the moment, like, but maybe he did. I'd like to think he got something for it.
I can't quote the source now, I'm pretty sure. Well, I know that I've read it.
All right, okay.
It's the source that I'd like to check.
My main material was Seamus de Burke's biography of Paddock Carney, who would have been his grandnephew, is it? Or, what was told in there was that the state had to purchase the rights to it twice because of changing copyright laws, that Carney never actually saw any money for the thing. Now,
I'd be interested to hear your side of it now, like, just to see.
Yeah, actually, Seamus Burke, PJ Burke used to have a costumiers and
Mm.
there. And when I came to Dublin first, I did history UCD in '66. So your thing is very interesting because the discussions that are all in public now were all underground then with people like Ruth W. Edwards actually was studying.
Oh, don't get me started on her now.
Don't you dare say anything about her. She was my tutor. I think I went to one tutorial.
I had Gerodo Tuig, so
Yeah.
I'll see you, Ruth Dudley Edwards, with a Gerodo Tuig, okay?
Well, Alex Martin and those were all this whole thing about the whole question of the rights and wrongs of it. That was all being discussed then. What it was, sort of, I believe that Ruth was told by her daddy, "No way, you publishing that for a couple of years because you'll be shot."
Yeah.
So it was an interesting. Anyway, PJ Burke at the time endured a couple of endured's the wrong word. A couple of lectures from him. Sort of on two things. One of them was the disgrace that his nephew was making the family at one stage, but also he was very interesting on Carney because PJ at that stage used to write plays and so did Seamus, and
Yeah.
this sort of things going on. That's what I was interested in.
Yeah.
I was at a talk there in town about 2 or 3 weeks ago, and somebody said that is it true that Paddy Carney's sister was married to Brenda Behan?
I think so. Yeah, there is a connection there, all right. Yeah, because there was a whole connection between the Beans and the Burkes, and yeah, it was his uncle. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
His sister was
Yeah.
Mother. Yeah.
I just thought what was really interesting. It was interesting you talked back to 50 years ago, and you know you're talking about the likes of Bull of Vogue being written 100 years after, and just those times that we need to reflect on things, you know. Well, the week that I've had to reflect on the first concert, first performance of the songs, and Craig hasn't heard them yet, but it's very interesting. A lot about what you were talking about, the tunes that were used by the singers who were singing their songs tonight. Because you know we had a lot of round table meetings while they were being developed, and a lot of these things were coming up. You know, just being really practical about what tunes are going to fit, or some people were historically looking at what tunes were popular in 1916. So one very good example that relates to a lot of what you were talking about there, Paul Riley's song. It's called "The Rise of the Wexford Volunteers." He very deliberately set out to write something like what would have been popular had it been written at the time. So he wrote something that he's looking for a march with a chorus. He looked at what tunes were popular at the time of Clare's Dragoons or something. So he wrote for that. And it works very well. It's very good kind of anthem-like chorus march. Interesting on Easter Monday in Enniscorthy, it just so happens that the Little Brass Band, apparently as they were playing by the parade, as they were going past the Athenaeum Hall only afterwards, and the Athenaeum is of course where the volunteers they took over that building as the headquarters in 1916. But the Little Brass Band happened to play, I don't know if it was by design, it would be fantastic if it was by design, it's fantastic either way. They played Clare's Dragoons as they passed by the Athenaeum, and they played there at a concert that Pierce had been at in March of 1916. So it's just a lovely layering that Paul was using that song, and not just that it's an interesting background. The song is stunning because it's exactly what he set out to do, you know. We'll finish with that tonight with a great rousing chorus.
That's a good, yeah.
Interesting you mentioned that because I grew up in the village I grew up with, the Rose and Tony Style was used Clare Dragoons. I love that so much more.
Connolly uses that for one of his songs in the book as well. He chooses that one as well.
It's a marching song because Clare Dragoons usually knows the march, but I knew it as a very quite slow love song.
One thing as regards a lot of songs were written in 1898 for the centenary, so people were looking back 100 years. Sometimes I think through what say green tinted glasses, they weren't seeing the full story. So a lot of the songs are sad, but also there's a glorious aspect to them. Whereas songs like Dún Laoghaire Green, which are much closer to the time, are more they're far sad. I mean, it is heart-wrenching to read that song. Now, I'm interested to see, like I've written a song obviously for tonight as well, so these are songs we've written 100 years out. I wonder how they're going to be regarded, because they won't, I imagine, have been I presume they're not all following a similar theme, but I think there's a great variance now. I'm glad in the sense that you said 50 years ago things weren't. Everything is open to the open now. We all have our own opinions. I have my own opinions. We all have our own opinions, and that's open to everyone now. And that's what I like about this now. We're talking about the women who were involved in 1916. We're talking about and someone said we're talking about. This is portrayed to me as a kid in the Christian Brothers as this nationalistic revolution. Socialism was hardly ever mentioned.
Yeah.
The fact that James Connolly was a socialist came to a big surprise to me in my teens when I started to read a lot more because we wouldn't have talked about this.
Yeah.
And I think this is to remember that those who went out, they were advanced nationalists, some of them were cultural nationalists, they were Republicans, they were socialists. And someone said to me yesterday at the Richard O'Carroll commemoration that it's our revolution. It belongs to all of us. So there are many, many disparate parts, and maybe that's why you said it was a fractious thing. That's it. There was no set aim as such. The IRB aim was always to get rid of the British.
Yeah.
Then we planned for the
Which is why Connolly was so reticent to get involved with them, because he didn't believe in the violence. He was reticent to get involved with the IRB. It was only after the whole World War I thing when he realised Socialists and Labour were going to support World War I, and essentially what he saw as the murder of innocent young lives, Irish lives in particular, that he was like, well, maybe a violent insurrection is the only way to go, and that's when he became part of the IRB at that point. Was in response to that. He was it strikes me that he was a very disillusioned person. He was always looking for this socialist movement to take off, and it just never did, which is why I think he moves around so much. I mean, he's in Scotland, then he's in America, then he's back to Scotland, then he's in the north of Ireland, and then he's in Dublin. He's always looking for this thing that's just going to explode into life, and it doesn't happen for him.
Did you notice, I never noticed myself, I was curious, any reference to when the French Labour leader, Jean Jaurès, was killed? Has Connolly make any comment about this?
I haven't read anything about it anyway. Yeah.
There wouldn't be a world war. He was the hope on which people replicate the working class wouldn't fight. And when he was killed, of course, the war had broken out and they did fight. Yeah. But I wonder, I've never heard anyone mention that. I was just curious what kind of
But it's funny too, looking at the decline in the ballads, like particularly that period. One thing I sort of forgot to mention that I suppose to keep in mind, a lot of these people were involved in the literary revival as well in the Gaelic League movement. They were trying to develop a higher form, if you will, of Irish literature, which was poetry. You find a lot of them, Thomas MacDonagh and a rake of them, particularly Joseph Mary Plunkett, wrote volumes of poetry. Ballads and songs would not have been considered a high form of literature. So I almost think, in one way, that might be why there was a decline in songwriting as well, because it was not a higher form of literature. And they were actually trying to devise an Irish literature, whether it was in Irish or English. It's always debated, because you have Yeats and all that who was writing at the time, but I actually think that might have to do with the decline in songs as well.
There was an invention of that. There was no theatre in the Irish tradition, no plays.
No, exactly.
And I think the first Irish play was Coss on Tuathran by
Yeah.
Thomas Hyde.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that I find about the present discussion is I think this is the end, in a sense. This is the end of a particular theory, in the sense that what I see happening at the moment with all the interest in 1916, that's the Irish nation having a discussion with itself on the rights and wrongs of it. And after that it can become history. It's no longer politics, it's no longer revolutions, that sort of caper. But when I grew up in Wicklow, strangely enough, in the 1950s that I remember, if you talked about the rebellion there, it wasn't 1916-22 they were talking about, it was 1798. Oh, very definitely. Just didn't enter it. It went so deep in the part in the, but then there was a much bigger death toll and all that in a much smaller area. So that
the old Joe, wasn't it? The guy was asked, could he vote in the election for Fianna Fáil county? You vote for Fianna. Oh, my family was always Fianna Fáil. You mean back to 1926? Oh no, 1798.
Sorry.
Can we get these talks online? Did you say that they're being?
Yeah, well, I've just done an audio recording of this one, and we did video recording last week in the NLI, and Thérèse said she'll make the presentation,
These are available already online, if you just, they're saved online free, it's the software that I use and that, and if you actually just Googled my name in the presentation, it would come up like, and you'd be able to look at it like, yeah.
So just Google your name.
Yeah, and Prezi or something, and you'd be able to find all them online.
The
Like
1916 song project.
So you'll find if you have one of these flyers, and give you one of these. Now the reason you don't have this was an air flyer with some details on it. But if you look up the website, we will in a couple of weeks have the audio recording.
And I can give Aileen the links as well to these. She can put the links up to these as well, so you can see them, because that's no problem. They're openly available. Like
they're all on your website.
they will be. Yeah,
They will be.
yeah. I'll give her the links and all that to put them up.
So there's a backlog of stuff to do. So they will be there.
They will be.
Yeah,
They will be.
yeah,
But don't
they will
be surprised
definitely,
if it's
like-
not when you look.
Because I'd really like to go over it again.
Yeah.
It was really interesting.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. Yeah, tomorrow I'm talking about the key figures in the Knoll, so it'll be a whole different middle bit again. The Knoll and the Seamus Ennis Centre tomorrow evening.
Up in the north.
North County Dublin.
No,
Up in the north.
Yeah.
Where's that?
North County Dublin.
It's North County Dublin. It's right on the border with Meath there, yeah.
Okay.
So the concert is there. The talk is there tomorrow night, just before the concert. The concert at 8:30 tomorrow night. So.
Oh, right. Yes,
Yeah.
okay.
And there'll be another talk. Same thing.
And a whole bunch more new songs.
So thanks for getting there.
Hopefully get more people.
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Very good. Thank you. Thank you, Million.